Good morning. This is Carolyn Borba from Dancing for Him Ministries. I am an online student in my second year, and what I'm going to be talking about today is the Pillars of Leadership, number 6. And it's the story about Gideon pulling down idols and building altars. And as we study this, what we really find is that, God began a transformation in Gideon's life. And Gideon really did not feel very qualified to do anything. But God directed him to do something that was very important. And that was to pull down the family idols and build an altar to the Lord. Now, when we talk about pulling down strongholds, or idols, it could be a myriad of things that are idols to us. But in this case, they were family idols, which means there was heritage there, which means that this would have been generations of idols that the whole family, in some cases churches, would have idols that were taking the place of God. And so what God told him is, it says, we are God's workmanship, and He is faithful to craft us into men and women who can fulfill His purpose. But we don't fulfill His purpose, but God will not fulfill His purposes in us until He has transformed us. And so that's what He was trying to do with Gideon. It's about praise and thanksgiving. If you have an idol, you worship that idol. If you have an altar, it's an altar of praise and worship. And that's what God wants. That's why we were created. We have talked about that many times in our studies. We were created to worship God. We were created to praise His holy name. So that's what God is trying to do with Gideon. So in Judges 6, we read about how God confronted Gideon, called him to leadership, and began to speak into his life. God spoke into Gideon's life. A new man that Gideon would become, even before he had become that new man. God was speaking leadership into his life. Gideon responded by building an altar. And in Judges 6:24, this was a very important event for Gideon, because the name of that area was Ophrah, or today it's called Ophrah. And what that meant, that altar, what that meant is the Hebrew name for peace. The Lord is peace. The Lord is peace. God was speaking peace and leadership into Gideon's life. And so he had been a weak, defeated man, and now he's being transformed into a mighty warrior for God. So it was a memorial. He built that altar as a memorial to God. And then after Gideon had built that altar, God asked him to do something that was unthinkable in those days, is that not only did someone tear down the idols of the family, but it was the son who tore down the idols of his father because they worshiped Baal. And in order for Gideon to have an altar of his own, he had to remove his father's altar and build upon that space, or his father's idol, build upon that space where Baal had been worshipped. But now it will be the Lord, our peace, where there will be an altar of praise and worship for Gideon. And Gideon was still, even though God was speaking leadership, he was still, remember it was his father, was generations. And he had to do it in the dark of the night because he was frightened. But he did it. He was obedient. So then, after he had pulled down those strongholds, then God said to Gideon, okay, now you have an altar. I'm calling you to leadership. You have an altar where you're praising and worshiping me. But you, Gideon, personally cannot have sin or cannot have altar or idols next to your altar. And God said to Gideon, you must now pull down the idols and the strongholds in your own life so that you will be pure, holy, and a mighty warrior for me. That was something Gideon would not have been able to do by himself. God was telling him, I will be with you. And so my activation for this was that there were 3 people building the altar to the world. They finished the altar and waited on their God to perform. Just like it talks about in the Bible. And they waited and they waited, and the idol did nothing. Then there were 3 people who built the altar to the Lord of peace. And they are all smiling, looking at that rock. The foundation that causes a reaction of raising hands, dancing together as they worship the God of peace that we love and honor. Thank you very much.